During the early morning hours of the 6th of June, 1944, constituting the initial wave, paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division leapt from aircraft and gliders into German-held France. Specifically, they touched down behind the banks of Utah Beach, within the interior of the Cottonton Peninsula. Approximately 6,670 paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division departed from 7 distinct airfields in England and spearheaded the nocturnal drop alongside the 82nd Airborne Division. The troops applied blackface for concealment. Their heads were shorn and their bodies were burdened with roughly 57 kilograms of arms, munitions, and gear. On their left shoulders, they proudly displayed the black, yellow, and white insignia of their unit, known as the Screaming Eagle. General Eisenhower, joined by Brigadier General Maxwell Davenport Taylor, leader of said division, visited the airfields in a jeep, personally bidding farewell and desiring good fortune to as many soldiers as he was able. Others heard announcements via the airplane loudspeakers. The aviators of the Air Force's 9th Troop Carrier Squadron revved their motors. The massive aircraft shuddered and their propellers hummed, then commenced taxiing sluggishly toward the airstrips. As the final light vanished in the western heavens, the Allied naval aircraft ascended, arranged into formation, and directed toward the French shoreline. Over 490 troop carrier vessels were aloft. Every plane bore a cluster of paratroopers, fluctuating in quantity, but averaging 14 per team. Each aircraft transported equipment bundles that were cast out the exit prior to the leap. Most planes also possessed munitions and supplies fastened to their outsides, which were released above the drop locations. Inside one, Douglas AC-47, sat Division Leader Maxwell Taylor, and within another was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the unit artillery chief. The main objective of the 101st Airborne Division was to open the path for the U.S. 4th Infantry Division, which disembarked at sunup on D-Day on Utah Beach. Per invasion strategies, the character of the beach zone determined the diverse tasks of the division's regiments. Stretching inland for roughly a mile was a band of swampland. Dirt trails capped by paved streets had been constructed across the marsh, and these offered the sole practical outlets from the coastal sector to the mainland west of the bog. Directly west of the hamlet of Saint-Martin-de-Varaville remained a forgotten German coastal battery that presented a menacing danger to the Utah Beach arrivals. The soldiers of the 502nd Regiment were charged with demolishing the coastal battery and adjacent artillery post, creating checkpoints to the north at Foucauville to stop German reinforcements from accessing the shore zone and ultimately seizing the routes into the region and holding them for infantry. The 506th Regiment, situated on the unit's far left, was to protect that side against hostile assault and act as a liaison between its parent group, the 6th Corps, and the adjacent 5th Corps moving from Omaha Beach. The leftover parachute regiment, the 501st, was granted the task of taking the La Barquette locks and wrecking the rail bridge and 4 road bridges northwest of Carentan. The ruining of the bridges was critical to stopping German reinforcements from penetrating the Utah Beach sector. That evening of the 5th of June, 1944, the German land troops were not on elevated alert. They also had viewed the meteorological forecasts and had dismissed the chance of an incursion until later in the month. Indeed, Field Marshal Rommel had traveled home on furlough the day prior. Numerous other high-ranking German leaders had vacated their stations and left for Rennes for a war simulation drill in Saint-Lô. General Erich Marx's midnight nativity celebration was commencing. Instead of transporting the 101st Airborne Division straight to its drop locations in Normandy, a curved path was plotted. The Allied air train was to depart England in a broad curve, aim for the Channel Isles of Guernsey and Jersey, then execute a nearly 90-degree pivot to the left, attain the French shoreline on the west flank of the Cherbourg Peninsula, release the forces, and subsequently proceed to finish the loop over the Channel and voyage back to England. In the meantime, on the terrain in occupied France, merely minutes distant from the troopers, incidents were already transpiring. The spearhead forces had entered into combat shortly past midnight. A band of roughly 120 American volunteer paratroopers, under the direction of Captain Frank Lillyman, had commenced lowering onto the Cottontan region. Not everything had transpired smoothly. The paratroopers faced mist and subsequently German anti-aircraft flak. Certain planes fractured formation, misplaced their orientation, and released their guys miles from their planned drop sites. One aircraft was compelled to alight in the English Channel. Yet at 12:15 a.m., Assault Chief Lillyman dove into the void, turning into the initial American warrior to touch down on occupied French earth. Lillyman and his team of 18 men were released in a pasture near Saint-Germain-de-Varville, roughly 2.5 kilometers from their goal. The C-47s soared at 1,500 feet, or 457 meters, to evade small arms shots from the soil. However, it was not small arms fire they met, nor what they needed to dread. German anti-aircraft cannons along the shore commenced firing with all their power. Massive shafts of illumination searched the heavens, pinpointed the carriers, and trapped them like defenseless moths. Flares and projectiles detonated within and surrounding the arrays, brightening the evening in a horrific and lethal exhibition. The massive cannons commenced shooting. Explosions of anti-aircraft flak propelled deadly fragments of metal through the transport's delicate floors. Thousands of machine gun tracers burned red and orange designs in the obscurity, penetrating the wings and bodies of the aircraft and all too frequently the forms of the defenseless troops. The C-47s swayed and vibrated under the massive force of the blasts. The troopers, their visages drawn, rose and connected their chutes. The months and months of drilling and anticipating were finished. Outdoors beneath, there was a foe attempting to terminate them. The warriors desired out. They required to place their feet on the soil and arms in hand to guard themselves. Merely minutes following arrival at the destination zones, many of the C-47 aviators started to panic. They had never previously undergone anything so frightening, even though they possessed commands not to execute any evasive maneuvering so as not to pull the soldiers away from their target. The flyers commenced violent actions to evade the lethal attack fire. Some rotated around, others ascended higher, others dipped almost to tree-line height. The maneuvering airplanes compelled others out of arrangement. Many disintegrated and dispersed randomly across the peninsula. The troops packed into the aircraft possessed no method of realizing what was occurring. Some, standing in planes with their hatches removed, could view the ghostly illumination in the heavens surrounding them. They even sensed a peculiar, haunting and frightening splendor in the fatal fireworks show. Yet the beauty was quickly vanished when a trooper was struck and shrieked in agony or crumbled. Some aviators, hopelessly misplaced, inadvertently released their guys into the channel. Burdened by gear, the humans drowned. Other flyers, leaping from side to shun anti-aircraft shots, released their men from only 60 or 90 meters. The fighters in these vessels struck the earth and perished before their chutes had an opportunity to deploy. The guys were released randomly into creeks, bogs, pastures and yards, and into the center of hamlets. They touched down on timber and roofs. Some were cast right into the center of German squad arrays. Some 1,500 men of the 101st Division were released entirely outside the 8-square-mile designated drop area. Even the 2 airborne divisions were mingled up. Some paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division, guided north and west around the crucial village of Sainte-Mère-Église, landed in 101st Division domain, and some from the 101st alighted in the 82nd Division's drop sector. In the obscurity, in the disarray, it rapidly appeared as if Normandy had been raided by a swarm of crickets. Troopers frantically signaled with their metallic toys, hunting for their buddies and superiors. Men commenced to assemble in tiny bands amid the thick hedges in the profound trenches. Brief skirmishes started to erupt as soldiers met German squads. By now, the Wehrmacht had been tipped off to the drop. German field leaders were still ignorant of the paratroopers' intent. They could not determine if the airdrop was a distraction, a commando raid, or if it was, in reality, the overture to a full-scale seaborne incursion. The American paratroopers were not solitary in their perplexity. The scattering of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions across the terrain created absolute mayhem in the German lines. Wehrmacht officers on the location frantically attempted to comprehend the circumstance. Their charts were filled with symbols of alleged parachute falls. The Americans appeared to be everywhere, as truly they were. Assaults arrived from all headings at once, yet for the German chiefs, no scheme appeared to be unfolding. Notwithstanding their scattering, notwithstanding the absence of command, the Screaming Eagles united and advanced. The distinct individuality of the American trooper soon triumphed in assertive deeds. The soldiers realized what they were there for and what they had to perform. The 101st Division's paratroopers positioning area contained German troops from the 709th Static Infantry Division and the 91st Airborne Division. These groups were not as remarkably drilled and were comprised of battalions from the east. These were a blend of volunteers, draftees, and former Soviet captives of war who had elected to battle in the German military rather than endure the severe circumstances of captives of war. Primarily and principally, it was with these groups that the 101st Division's paratroopers squared off. By sunrise on the 6th of June, a significant portion of the 101st Division's task had been fulfilled. The 4 causeways directing from Utah Beach were safeguarded. Men, tanks, and gear were moving along these causeways inland. The German coastal battery and artillery quarters had been wrecked. Roadblocks had been formed outside Foucaultville to guard the division's right wing and stop enemy reinforcements from moving south toward the invasion shores. Nevertheless, there was still much combat to be executed. Advancing towards Carentan, the 101st Airborne Division, the 3rd Battalion, 506th Regiment, whose assignment was to capture the 2 timber bridges over the Douve, was cast into a hornet's nest. Their zone was one of the scarce spots in Normandy where the Germans had expected a paratroop raid. The pastures were encircled by mortar and machine gun shots. As the initial troopers began to drop, the Germans ignited a dwelling, lighting up the whole region. 20 soldiers perished before they contacted the soil. The battalion chief, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Wolverton, his executive officer, and one of the company leaders were slain in the trap. The other company chiefs were promptly seized. By the dusk of the following day, as the 506th Regiment burrowed in around Beaumont, General Taylor recognized that his guys must, at all costs, battle their path through Saint-Côme-du-Mont, secure the route to Carentan, if feasible the crossings, and finally seize Carentan. This task was of supreme immediacy, as the Germans already realized what was transpiring on the Normandy front and comprehended the significance of Carentan and the bridge spans. It was more than merely dominating roads and bridges for armored carriers. Carentan now stood as the linchpin to unifying the American troops. It rested on the left side of the 101st Regiment, separating the squads that had alighted on Utah Beach from those that had alighted on Omaha Beach. Field Marshal Rommel, arriving from Germany, pinpointed the village of Carentan on his status chart. He planned to maintain that spot and utilize it as a launch pad for a counterstrike that could divide the 2 American Army Corps back to the sands. He distributed the command of the day to the German 6th Parachute Regiment, which was guarding the city. Carentan will be protected to the final human. The 101st's assault on the morning of the 8th of June commenced with a persistent artillery bombardment spanning over an hour. Some 2,500 105mm projectiles poured down on the German spots. A 3-pronged move then started behind the artillery, one straight up the route to Saint-Côme-du-Mont, synchronized with a dual envelopment by the 501st and 327th Regiments behind the city. By 8 a.m. that forenoon, Colonel Ewell and his 3rd Battalion, the 101st, had pierced the German lines. He resolved to move forward. Although the 506th on his right side was stuck, but his forces met severe artillery shooting from Carentan and machine gun shots from the structures on the initial bridge. As his men formed skirmish lines to return fire, they were hit from the rear by German paratroopers. The battalion wheeled around to meet the attack. Time and again the Germans charged the American lines. Each time the attack was repulsed, the Germans came closer and closer to breaking through. During the afternoon, the situation became precarious for Ewell's battalion. His men began to buckle slightly under the tremendous pressure of the constant German attacks. Caught in a brutal crossfire, the Germans withdrew, leaving their dead and wounded behind. At least for the time being, the pressure was relieved. 6 times that day, the Germans counterattacked the 3rd Battalion, and all 6 times were repulsed. The battalion lost 25% of its men killed and wounded, but held its hard-won ground. Finally, the Germans gave up the fight. They withdrew from Saint-Côme, but not before blowing up the bridge that spanned the causeway to Carentan. Since blowing up these bridges was part of the 101st Division's mission, it seemed the Germans had already accomplished part of their task, but the situation had suddenly reversed. General Taylor preferred his forces to capture the Carentan bridges intact for use by the advancing American forces. However, the Germans realized they had missed their golden opportunity for a large-scale armored attack from Carentan. But it was still a crucial crossroads town. Therefore, as a defensive maneuver, it was best to destroy the bridges. And yet, to General Taylor's pleasant surprise, the Germans only destroyed the 2nd bridge. This turned out to be a mixed blessing, as the men of the 101st Division would soon discover. From the new positions below Saint-Côme-du-Mont to the town of Carentan, the paved road crossed approximately a mile of swamp. The road rose on a shoulder some 6 or 7 feet above the surface of the swamp. It became a causeway over the Douve and Jordan rivers, which converged opposite Carentan. This entire stretch of road was exposed to small arms and artillery fire. There was no shelter. It was possible to dig a foxhole on the side of the embankment, but that was the limit of protection and concealment that could be expected along this road. With no other option, the 101st had to advance. After the capture of Saint-Côme-du-Mont, soldiers of the 506th established outposts all the way to the blown bridge. From their foxholes, men equipped with binoculars could see the Germans installing machine gun nests in the houses on the outskirts of town. That night, Taylor ordered the 3rd Battalion, 502nd, to advance through the 506th's positions and lead the attack on Carentan. General Taylor's plan was to encircle Carentan on 3 sides. After crossing the causeways, the 502nd was to turn below Carentan toward an objective called Hill 30, cutting off the German retreat. At the same time, the 327th Glider Regiment would attack Carentan directly from the 502nd's left flank. The 501st would attack from a direction almost opposite the 502nd, turn around at Carentan, and complete the encircling movement by rendezvousing with the 502nd on Hill 30. Carentan. The first clashes with the Waffen-SS. Carentan was home to 2 battalions of the German 6th Parachute Regiment under the command of Major Friedrich von der Heydte. The remaining pieces of the 91st Infantry Division were also located there. On the 8th of June, parts of both divisions had withdrawn from Saint-Côme-du-Mont 2 kilometers to the northwest toward Carentan when paratroopers of the 101st Division captured the town. The day before, on the 7th of June, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Goetz von Berlichingen, stationed in the Thouars area, had received orders to move to Normandy. It was not yet fully equipped and was part of the German Oberkommando Reserve. The lack of transport space, constant Allied air attacks, destroyed bridges over the Loire, and ultimately the destroyed rail network made its transfer to the front difficult. The advanced detachments arrived at Angers on the 9th of June and at Saint-Lô on the 10th of June. The division formed 2 battle groups with its Panzer Grenadier regiments. The 37th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment was sent to Carentan, while the 38th Regiment was sent to the right bank to protect the flanks of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. After securing Saint-Côme-du-Mont, the right flank was ready to attack the access dam. There were indications that Carentan should not be vigorously defended. The 506th had established outposts on the first 2 bridges, and the next day conducted a reconnaissance sortie on the outskirts of Carentan. They set fire near the 4th bridge. American aerial reconnaissance reported the evacuation of the town and that a large hole had opened in the railroad embankment, making the road the best option to reach Carentan. The access dam ran narrow and straight through the swamp, allowing the Americans to quickly detect the advancing Germans and easily defend themselves in all directions. The attack was carried out by the 502nd Regiment. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole set out with the 3rd Battalion shortly after midnight on the 10th of June. Since the engineers who were to repair Bridge No. 2 could not work under enemy fire, the attack was called off shortly afterward. Shortly afterward, a patrol was sent out to scout the road. They crossed the canal by boat at bridge number 2. When they attempted to continue toward bridge number 4, they were blocked by a large steel gate, the so-called Belgian Gate. As they attempted to open this obstacle, a mortar shell suddenly exploded next to them. At that same moment, a storm of machine gun fire and more grenades began raining down on them from German positions along the road. Although the patrol had to withdraw again around 5:30 a.m., it was now known that the Germans had not yet abandoned the defense of Carentan. The battalion was notified that the new attack date would be in the afternoon. This time, the 65th Armored Field Artillery Battalion and the 97th Glider Field Artillery Battalion would provide significant gun support. Most of the artillery fire was concentrated on known and suspected enemy positions, which were primarily southwest of bridge number 4. By noon, the pioneers had still not closed the large gap in bridge number 2. Lieutenant Colonel Cole and 3 other soldiers laid planks across the bridge so the battalion could cross one by one in the early afternoon. From the direction of Carentan, an 8.8 centimeter anti-aircraft gun repeatedly opened fire on the road, but did not stop the men. The soldiers either crouched or crawled along the dam. After 3 hours, when most of the Americans had crossed 3 bridges and were beyond bridge number 2, the Germans opened fire from protective hedges and a large farmhouse on the right. The men immediately headed for the trenches. As they attempted to advance further, a machine gun bombarded the trenches with numerous bursts. After 3 soldiers were hit, the group withdrew in long line. The battalion advanced along the road, unable to defend itself on the right and left flanks. They were constantly under German machine gun fire. They had to pass under the Belgian Gate at bridge number 4, one after another under direct fire. Without support from artillery, which bombarded the German positions beginning at 4 p.m., a portion of Company G, which led the battalion, took up positions to the right of the bridge, while the rest attempted to slip through the narrow opening. 6 soldiers managed to get through, but the 7th was hit. The action was immediately stopped and a defensive position was established. The entire battalion was now trapped. The company crouched next to the dam at bridge number 3 and was virtually exposed to German fire. They were hit hard, first by rifle fire and around 11:30 p.m., also by 2 German fighter planes which fired on them and dropped bombs on their position. During a brief ceasefire at midnight, only 21 men and 2 officers of the company's original 80 soldiers were able to withdraw beyond bridge number 2. Around 4 a.m. on the 11th of June, Regimental Command ordered the 3rd Battalion to continue the attack. In the darkness, G Company and Headquarters Company advanced through the gate at Bridge 4. They straddled the road embankment. The main German position appeared to be a large farmhouse to the right of the road, surrounded by high hedges. It rose clearly from the marshland on a small hill. As the first soldiers approached the yard, they came under rifle, machine gun, and mortar fire. A concentrated American artillery barrage did little to change the situation. Therefore, Lieutenant Colonel Cole launched a bayonet attack on the German position. To do so, he had the artillery fire smoke bombs into the area. At 6:15 a.m., after the artillery fire ceased, Cole gave the whistle to attack. But of the original 250 men, only 20 followed him. Because the Americans were dispersed over a very large area, the order had not been widely disseminated. In addition, Company G made contact with the enemy and was engaged by German units with machine guns on the prairie east of the Carentan Road. The commanding officer was wounded by an artillery shell that was fired too short. When the company heard Cole's whistle and saw the other Americans running toward the farmhouse, they ran after him. The men of Company H were the first to reach the farmhouse, but found it deserted. Enemy fire now came from a tall hedge that ran at right angles to the road. The Americans stormed into the area and mowed down the Germans with hand grenades and bayonets. The only German resistance now lay to the south from where the Americans were receiving constant fire. Cole actually wanted to continue the advance immediately, but the battalion no longer had the strength to do so. All the Americans assembled near the farmhouse. There, it quickly became apparent that the units had become confused in the chaos of the fighting and had suffered heavy losses in some cases. Therefore, the 1st Battalion 52nd Parachute Infantry was ordered to continue the attack beyond the 3rd Battalion's position. Finally, faced with the prolonged American advance, the German paratroopers abandoned the town of Carentan on the afternoon of the 11th of June. At dawn the following day, the Americans launched the expected concentric attack on both sides of Carentan. However, the attack met with no success. During the afternoon, the Americans reached Hill 30 south of the town. Meanwhile, further south, Götz von Berlichingen's forces organized and reinforced themselves with artillery and tanks to advance and recapture Carentan as quickly as possible. The latter had eventually been taken by the American 101st Airborne Division. The main attack would be carried out by the 37th Regiment, supported by the 6th Parachute Regiment and 2 Sturmgeschütz companies. During the night, the counter-attacking units took up positions at their starting points. At 5:30 a.m. on the 13th of June, Götz von Berlichingen's artillery bombarded the positions of the 101st Airborne Division. 15 minutes later, SS Panzer Grenadiers began their advance against the American paratroopers. These forces belonged mainly to the 37th Regiment's 1st Battalion. Behind them followed 17 Studutes from the Panzer Battalion. From the outset, the attack gained ground without encountering resistance. But when the companies crossed the Carentan-Baupte road, they were flanked by selective and fragmented fire, causing their first casualties. Most of them were caused by snipers among the trees. Fighting finally broke out in the sector. By 7:30 a.m., the 1st Battalion of the 37th Regiment had achieved a significant advance, but at the cost of heavy losses. At 9 a.m., the 1st Battalion reached the southwestern edge of Carentan, while shortly afterward, the 2nd Battalion of the 6th Parachute Regiment reached the station grounds west of the town. Until then, the Panzer Grenadier advance had only been 500 meters deep. By 9:50 a.m., the German advance had ceased. From midday, the Americans counterattacked with tanks from the 2nd Armored Division. The 37th Regiment was forced to withdraw under heavy American pressure. The counterattack continued throughout southern Carentan. Under these circumstances, the Waffen-SS ordered the Germans to halt all counterattacks and withdraw to their starting lines. That same afternoon, the 2nd Battalion of the 37th SS Regiment moved along the road toward Carentan, while the 1st Battalion dug into the left of the road. The German counterattack had failed. At night, the division organized a new defensive line from south of Carentan to the marshy meadows of Gorges. By the 14th of June, 1,944 regiments of the 101st Airborne Division launched an attack along the Carentan-Perrier road, but were halted near L'Allier. Fighting continued on all sides. By the 15th of June, all was secure. Armored vehicles and infantry drove the Germans back so far that Carentan became a rear reserve area. The Screaming Eagles established a defensive line south and southwest of the town. 2 weeks later, the 101st Division moved into a camp about 25 kilometers northwest near Cherbourg. For the division, the Battle of Normandy was over. All missions had been accomplished. On the 7th of July, General Taylor called a division assembly and told his men, "Run forward toward the enemy. Show that the German soldier is not a Superman. You have beaten them on their own ground, and you can beat them on any ground." The following week, the 101st Division boarded speedboats and sailed back to England for rest. In their battle for Normandy, the Screaming Eagles had suffered 4,670 casualties. Netherlands. Throughout the delightful English summertime of 1944, while the 101st Airborne Division was refitting, reorganizing and strengthening its forces, the Allied armies swept across France and Belgium. Paris was freed in August. The Canadian First Army had isolated all German troops along the Channel ports and had nearly attained the Dutch frontier. The British Second Army had seized Antwerp, a crucial Allied harbour facility. The American First Army had progressed to the border of the Siegfried Line, Hitler's renowned defense barrier along the German boundary. General Patton and his fresh Third Army moved quickly through southeastern France and had arrived at the Moselle River at Nancy. The Supreme Command deemed the airborne maneuvers in Normandy so triumphant that the First Allied Airborne Army was formed. The American portion of this force was titled the 18th Airborne Corps and included the United States 17th, 82nd, and 101st Airborne Divisions. Command of the Army went to Lieutenant General Lewis Brereton, leader of the U.S. 9th Air Force. During the summer of 1944, numerous parachute drops were designed, yet the swift progress of the Allied troops cancelled them all prior to their start. The Germans were on the run, but far from beaten. The Allied High Command plan from the very start of Operation Overlord called for the incursion of Germany from the north. While Field Marshal Montgomery was sure that he could eventually force the Germans out of Holland, the plan required a quick move before the Germans could construct a fresh defense barrier along their frontier with Holland. The many canals and rivers traversing the nation made it simple for the withdrawing Germans to apply delaying methods. Bridges could be exploded and checkpoints formed at crucial crossings. Meanwhile, a firm defense was being constructed on the boundary. Thus, Operation Market Garden was conceived. The scheme was as follows. Operation Garden would be executed on the soil. The British 30th Corps, led by tanks from the Guards Armoured Division, was to depart from the Belgian-Dutch frontier and rapidly aim for the city of Arnhem, 107 kilometers away on the shores of the Rhine. Ahead of them, laying a rug along the sole route that traversed the canals and rivers to Arnhem. The 1st Allied Airborne Army would drop from the heavens and capture the bridges with a lightning-fast surprise raid, and this would be Operation Market. The solitary road that extended along the backbone of Holland was the linchpin to the whole maneuver. This highway with its hamlets and bridges was the only appropriate path for the armoured transports that had to traverse the lands. The Allied High Command trusted that with the bridges and other tactical spots in the grasp of the airborne troops, the British could move quickly along the passage, skirt Arnhem, and cross the Rhine to Nunspeet. This would ensnare all the Germans between the route and the ocean and clear the path for a breakout into Germany. The schedule called for 30th Corps to attain Arnhem within 48 hours, since the airborne soldiers dropping without tanks, artillery, or resupply would be unable to hold out any longer against the unavoidable German counterattacks. The British 1st Airborne was to launch at Arnhem. To the south, where the road crossed the Waal at Nijmegen and the Meuse at Grave, the 82nd Division would launch. The 101st Division's task was to assume control of a 16-mile span of highway that commenced behind the German front line at Eindhoven and stretched north through the villages of Sint-Udenrode and Wegel. Together, the Allied airborne troops, both gliders and paratroopers, totaled about 35,000 men. The task given to the 101st Division was particularly vital. The Guards Division had to reach them first. If the Eagles failed to clear the passage, any act by the other units further north would be useless. Furthermore, even after the Guards had passed, the Eagles were accountable for the safety of their segment of road. There would be Germans on both flanks of the route attempting to sever it, and 16 miles of highway was too much for one division to guard entirely. The troopers of the 101st Division would soon title it Hell's Highway. General Taylor realized that the sole thing he could perform along that 16-mile passage was to guard the key bridges and villages and sustain contact between those spots through vigorous patrols. In reality, the whole maneuver was like a long chain with frail links along the 64 miles of road. If at any spot the Germans managed to shatter these weak links, the operation faced ruin. The Allied High Command relied on the factor of surprise to execute the operation. Surprise and intelligence accounts suggesting that the German forces in the region were poorly arranged, and in some instances with rear area groups that would present little opposition in real battle. These intelligence accounts were mostly accurate, but not completely. Operation Market Garden was slated for Sunday, the 17th of September. At 10 a.m., some 5,000 Army airborne carriers, bombers, fighters, and 2,500 gliders were slated to ascend. The drop was to commence at 1:30 p.m. An hour later, following an artillery bombardment and under the shield of fighter bombers, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Vandeleurs' Irish Guards would initiate their assault along Hell's Highway. The choice to conduct this daylight jump was a daring one. It was grounded on two elements: the disarray and scattering of the paratroopers following the nighttime Normandy drop and Allied air dominance. Furthermore, remembering the painful encounters of Normandy, General Taylor insisted on a focused drop. Both the 502nd and 506th Regiments would drop northwest of the village of Sun, the identical zone that would later be utilized for glider arrivals. The duty given to the 502nd was to protect the landing zone, seize the road bridge at Sint-Udenrode, defend Sun, and back the 506th in its raid on Eindhoven. The 506th Regiment was to take the Wilhelmina Canal Bridge at Son, then pivot south and take Eindhoven with its 4 road bridges over the Dommel. The 501st, which had been given the northernmost drop area, was charged with taking the road and rail bridges over the Zuid-Willemsvaart Canal at Veghel. General Taylor also gave a tiny extra task to the 502nd to take the road and rail bridges at best west of the regimental zone. This was not part of the initial combat zone given to the 101st. However, upon checking the operational charts, General Taylor thought it would be a fine concept to aid securing the flank through Best. As the C-47s soared over the channel, no German fighters neared them. Near the drop areas, anti-aircraft shooting began to increase. But this wasn't Normandy. The troop carrier command flyers had studied a harsh lesson. Well, after Normandy, General Eisenhower had scolded them for their expensive errors. This time, there was no evasive maneuver to shun flak, no shattering of formation. Even as their aircraft exploded into flames, the flyers kept path for those crucial seconds needed for a precise jump. Entire battalions fell together, landed near their gear, and were arranged and ready in less than an hour. It was a parade platform jump. The gliders that came an hour later were not so fortunate, as 17 of the 70 never attained the drop zone. For the inhabitants of Veghel, who were anticipating freedom from the Germans, the view of a whole regiment of paratroopers falling around them must have been a source of delight. Their hamlet was the objective of the 501st Regiment, commanded by Colonel Howard Johnson. They met nothing more severe than dispersed rifle shots and the occasional burst of machine gun fire. All the bridges were taken. They then moved toward Veghel and there connected with the scouts of the 1st Battalion. Some stubborn Germans put up a struggle but were rapidly beaten. 50 captives were seized. The citizens of Veghel came out of their dwellings and paraded through the avenues en masse, yelling and weeping with glee. They presented food and beverage to the troops, conversing in fractured English. For a time, the conflict was disregarded, and the troops found it hard to form defensive spots in the village against German counterstrikes. Finally, reason triumphed. The Dutch went back to their residences and let the troops proceed with their plans. Battling for the villages persisted throughout the day. Thus, at the close of the initial day of combat in Holland, the 101st was able to announce the accomplishment of most of its goals. Except for the seizure of Eindhoven, all the hamlets and bridges had been captured. The unforeseen German opposition at best was proving to be a barb in the division's side, but this was deemed a minor goal, not part of the starting task. In brief, it could have been much worse, but the worst was yet to arrive. Further north along the passage, the American 82nd Airborne Division and the British 1st Airborne Division were enduring their own grave issues with a resolved foe. The whole operation was behind timetable, Operation Market Garden. At first dawn, Lieutenant Wierzbowski, a platoon chief with the 101st Airborne Division, and his guys had their initial clear view of the bridge they had been given to take. It was a tempting view, so near yet so far distant. The bridge was not much, as bridges often are, a single-span concrete form a little over 30 meters long. But south of the bridge, he spotted a barracks with dug-in spots around it. These spots were stuffed with German troopers. Whenever one of the troopers became too clear, the Germans opened fire from both flanks. Early that forenoon, the men saw a band of Germans nearing them from the trees along the north bank of the canal. Stragglers from the 2nd Battalion's raid. The troops held their shots until the Germans were within 50 meters. Then they opened fire and pierced them with rounds, killing about 35. At about 10 in the forenoon, watchers saw a German trooper and a civilian near the other side of the bridge. They stayed there for about 20 minutes, seemingly doing nothing but talking. They wished to shoot the German, but thinking the civilian was Dutch, they held back for dread that a stray round might strike an Allied civilian. An hour later, there was a horrific blast. The bridge quivered and rose up. Rubble of concrete and steel flew through the sky and fell on the forces in their ditches. So, the best bridge was gone, but Wierzbowski had no method of relaying this data to the regiment. Nevertheless, Wierzbowski and his men felt they had been sent on duty and would remain and do the finest they could. As the day moved on and the state declined, they began to drop faith. Indeed, unknown to them, the regiment had already given them up for lost. Then their hopes were suddenly revived. Suddenly, a British armoured personnel carrier and a reconnaissance transport appeared across the canal. The Germans opened fire on them. The vehicles paused at the edge of a structure and began shooting with all their machine guns. The Germans dug in around the barracks zone, broke free, and ran. By the close of the day, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had guarded most of their goals, but they had failed to take the vital bridge over the Waal River at Nijmegen. The well-entrenched Waffen-SS troops were making things very hard for them. Only a valiant effort finally managed in taking the bridge. Crossing the Waal the next day, somewhat behind schedule, the armoured guard found that the Germans had utilised the extra time to form defences along the remainder of the path. Further progress was sluggish and expensive, but that was not all. The British in Arnhem at the peak of the corridor had been unfortunate from the start. They landed in an area heavily inhabited by Germans. Their airborne supplies fell into enemy hands. Their men north of the Niederrhein failed to take the bridge that would link them to the south bank of the river. Without dominance of that bridge, the armoured guard would never reach them. By the third day, the position was becoming dire. The airborne arrivals in Holland did not wholly startle the German high command. Hitler and his generals knew that the Allies had massive airborne forces prepared for action where they did not know. Judging the total situation, they examined Holland, but decided that such a venture was too perilous for the Allies. Even so, when the initial paratroopers began to fall, the German high command understood the importance of what was occurring and instantly began readying countermeasures. Since the airborne troops had landed in the sector of the German 1st Parachute Army, its leader, Colonel General Kurt Student, was accountable for the instant reply. He subordinated all Luftwaffe units in the area to local leaders. Anti-aircraft units were shaped into battle groups. New fortress battalions were added to the 1st Parachute Army. The German strategy for engaging Market Garden was to hold the corridor at its base and then sever it as quickly as possible near Eindhoven. If this were done after the armoured elements had moved north, the British 30th Corps would be caught in a net and could be methodically destroyed. In any case, Hitler believed the line could be held at Nijmegen and the corridor cut thereafter. Not all German generals agreed. Some believed all bridges along the route should be destroyed and the German armies should retreat behind the Rhine to defend themselves. But Field Marshal Walter Model would hear no such thing. He had no doubt about the German ability to hold the key bridge at Arnhem. He had enough troops in the area and more on the way to prevent a Rhine crossing in force. Alert units of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen were in the area, along with those of the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. As long as the German armies remained there at the top of the corridor, counterattacks would be launched along the entire corridor to try to cut the vital line. For the Screaming Eagles, the second phase of their Operation Market Garden was about to commence. On the morning of the 20th of September, the Germans swooped in and raided Sun. They moved in force against the 327th Regiment, which held a 400-yard front south of the Wilhelmina Canal. The outpost that raised the alarm was overrun, and the company leader, Captain William Miller, had to quickly move his men from one place to another to stop an immediate advance. Fortunately, the ground was flat, and 2 German tanks leading the assault were afraid of getting too close. The Germans then shifted their attack to the north of the canal, defended by the 1st Battalion of the 506th Regiment. This attack was also repulsed. An hour later, the Germans renewed their assault, this time with more infantry and 8 tanks. Fierce fighting ensued. The lines began to give way. More men were urgently needed. Suddenly, 10 British tanks appeared from Best. The two lead tanks were disabled after passing over an American minefield. The remaining 8 engaged the German tanks and destroyed 4 of them, losing 1 of their own. By mid-morning, a general German withdrawal had begun. A few kilometers to the north at Sint-Oedenrode, the Germans were also keeping the 101st Division occupied. Batteries of self-propelled guns and 88 caliber guns shelled the town, sporadically hampering movement. Under this intermittent fire, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 502nd Regiment moved away from their positions at Best and into Sint-Oedenrode. At the same time, an advanced detachment was preparing an old castle in the town for use as a division command post. By 5:30 that afternoon, it was all over. With only minor casualties, the battalion had killed 40 Germans, wounded many more, and taken 418 prisoners. On the 5th day of Operation Market Garden, the German pressure on the 101st Division eased slightly. As many suspected, it was simply the lull before the storm. But the soldiers took advantage of this respite. During the first 3 days of the campaign, no wounded had been evacuated due to heavy traffic northward. However, on the 4th day, ambulances and trucks crossed the lines. On the 5th day, as the fighting subsided, these vehicles loaded with the wounded returned to an evacuation hospital in Belgium. General Taylor took steps to move some of his men north, while the British moved more men to the base of the corridor and took over some of the defensive positions. Taylor also wanted to widen the corridor as much as possible, keeping the Germans out of range of roadside artillery and making it more difficult for them to effect a complete cut. The blow the 101st Division had waited 2 days for fell that morning. A German attack cut the road between Wegel and Uden. When radioed to Kinnard and Ewell, the order came to repatriate all British tanks. They were needed elsewhere. The German encirclement south of Schiendel could not continue as planned. The 4 battalions eventually abandoned the attack and headed for the corridor between Wegel and Sint-Oedenrode. Thus, a day that began with high hopes for a brilliant offensive became a day of desperate defense. The Germans likely chose Wegel as a point of attack because the destruction of the bridges over the Aar River and the Zuid-Willemsvaart Canal would halt traffic along the corridor long after the attackers had left. The Dutch resistance managed to warn the division that morning about the advance of large German forces toward the corridor at Wegel, but by then little could be done. The Germans had a convoy of 400 trucks advancing from the east, composed of panzers and the 280th Assault Gun Brigade. From the west, a large infantry force with 5 mobile guns was approaching along both banks of the canal, ready to attack. At around 9:30 a.m., the Germans launched a coordinated attack on Wegel from the southeast, north, and northwest. The largest battle to date in Holland began. As the assault began, the advanced guard of the 1st Battalion, 506th, was already moving toward Uden, north of Wegel. Aboard trucks, jeeps, and any other type of vehicle they could muster, the soldiers rushed north, commanded by Colonel Charles Chase, the regimental executive officer. They arrived in Uden at 11 a.m., just in time to be cut off and isolated by the Germans, who cut the road beneath them. Fortunately, the Germans were unaware that Colonel Chase had little more than a company of men, or they could have easily overwhelmed him. The colonel astutely redeployed his men throughout the town, creating the impression of a larger force. His deception worked. The Germans never attempted an all-out attack against him. At Wegel, General McAuliffe was in charge of the defense. He had arrived in the village that morning to scout for a new location for the division command post. When the attack broke out, General Taylor ordered him to stay and take control. Shortly after 11, the men of the 2nd Battalion, 501st, spotted the tanks and infantry of the 107th Panzer Corps, advancing along the road leading east to the town of Heeswijk. The battle had begun, considerably outnumbered and outgunned. The soldiers responded to the assault from trenches and houses on the outskirts. The first enemy wave attacked them with bazookas and mortars. They stopped the tanks. When the infantry approached with their rifles, grenades, and machine guns, the soldiers held firm, poured all possible fire into the enemy, and repulsed the first wave. That was the most they could do at the moment. Desperate, they watched as part of the German column turned left toward the Uden road and cut it off. There was no one to stop them. Then the Germans turned around and attacked Wegel from the Uden road as well. The situation was becoming desperate when the 2nd Battalion 506th Regiment entered the town from the south. General McAuliffe quickly escorted them to the northern perimeter in time to engage the Germans coming up the Uden road. With the 2nd Battalion was a group from the 81st Airborne Anti-Aircraft Battalion, towing their 57mm guns, useful as anti-tank weapons. Seeing Colonel Cox, commander of the 81st Regiment, General McAuliffe shouted to him, "Get one of your guns up that road and take out a tank. That might stop them." Colonel Cox climbed into the nearest gun-towing jeep and told the driver to move. In the jeep were Captain Adolf Gimmart, Corporal William Bowe, and Private First Class Roy Roberts. Together, they ran down the Uden road toward the sound of the gunfire. A sad sight greeted them. A German Mark 5 Panther tank was straddling the road, firing at a British anti-aircraft unit that had been caught en route as the attack began. This unit was equipped only with 37mm guns. Oddly enough, when Colonel Cox arrived on the scene, there was a 37mm gun piloted by an American crew from the 327th, dueling with the German tank. No one knew how they got there, mixed up with the British, but there they were, and their duel was brave, but futile. Firing 37mm shells at a German Panther was as futile as throwing rocks at it. Colonel Cox wasted no time seeking cover. He and his crew turned their 57 into the middle of the road, about 100 yards from the tank. The Germans spotted them and fired. The crew saw the muzzle flash, but luckily the shell passed over their heads and hit a house behind them, causing a shower of masonry. Calmly, Colonel Cox looked through the gun sight, aimed and fired. The shot knocked some tracks off the tank, destroying it. His second quick shot set it ablaze. That setback for the moment weakened the German attack, but they didn't stop. They circled the 2nd Battalion on the left, continuing the pressure in a northern arc around Wegel. More help was needed and fast. The 327th was on its way, but because the corridor in their area remained clogged with heavy northbound British traffic, the gliders were forced onto secondary roads. This slowed their march. When Colonel Harper and his 327th Regiment reached Sint-Oeden Road, they knew the attack on Wegel was underway and the situation was dire. Gathering all possible motorized transport, Colonel Harper loaded his mortars, anti-tank guns, heavy machine guns, 2 companies of the 3rd Battalion and another battery of the 81st Anti-Aircraft Battalion and headed north along the main road toward Wegel. They arrived around 1 p.m. and immediately took up defensive positions on the left flank of the 2nd Battalion, 506th. Together, the two groups successfully repelled the Germans and opened a gap in the road. An hour later, the Germans attacked from the west, advancing against the highway bridge over the canal. With their mobile heavy artillery, they cleared the bridge area. General McAuliffe and Colonel Sink rushed to see what could be done. Along the way, they encountered Company D of the 506th heading toward Uden. Unaware that the road was closed, they turned the company around and took it with them to the bridge area. Just as this unit arrived, a group of Sherman tanks approached noisily from the south, heading straight for the bridge. The tankers were unaware that the German guns had it completely covered. If they reached the bridge, they would be easy prey. There was only one way to stop them, and Colonel Sink succeeded. He ran across the bridge amid a hail of small arms fire and stopped the tanks in time. The presence of the tanks, the fresh troops, and the stubborn defense of the bridge discouraged the Germans. They broke off the attack and then turned south to cut the road between Wegel and Sint-Oeden-Rode, which would complete the encirclement of Wegel. But just as they were cutting the road, the rest of the 327th Glider and 321st Artillery came marching up the road from Sint-Oeden-Rode. Quickly, Companies A and C deployed and advanced against the German right flank, firing as they went. The Germans scattered and headed west back across the canal. The two assault companies continued advancing until the road was clear and joined the men fighting on the vital bridge. 70 prisoners were rounded up. The road south was again open. The bridge was momentarily safe from enemy attack. Throughout the day and well into the night, the Germans attacked, were defeated, re-advanced, and were repulsed again. The town of Wegel was constantly bombarded by artillery. The Dutch civilians, so exultant over their liberation several days earlier, were now huddled in their cellars, praying that something of their small town would be left standing when the battle was over. Meanwhile, the soldiers were stranded in Uden, where the Germans had cut the road north of Wegel. They had wreaked havoc on everything they found along it. Burning British vehicles of all types littered the highway. Dozens of trucks loaded with vital supplies for the troops in Nijmegen and Arnhem were looted or destroyed. Cutting the highway was like severing an artery leading to the heart of Operation Market Garden. The road to the north would have to be opened. The Germans would have to be denied the two vital bridges over the canal. The next morning, the Germans attacked again from the south and west, attempting to take the canal bridge. They were stopped again. Then the paratroopers of the 101st Division counterattacked. 2 battalions of the 506th advanced north along the road toward Uden. In the face of their determined attack, the Germans melted away. The soldiers advanced more than a mile along the road. There they encountered advanced elements of the British Grenadier Guards, moving down from the north. The road was clear. The men at Uden were safe. With the corridor clear, the soldiers turned their attention to the Germans west and southeast of Wegel. They attacked the enemy concentrations at both points and drove them back. However, the battle was not over. For 4 more days, it wavered. From the northwest, a powerful German force, including SS units, arrived with the objective of once again cutting the road between Wegel and Sint-Oeden Road near the town of Kovering. In the sand dunes near the town of Eerde, the pride of the German Wehrmacht faced troops from the 501st Regiment and were defeated. But a small group, about 200 men and a few tanks, slipped away from the battlefield, found an unprotected road and attacked Kovering. They reached a British convoy, disabled 3 tanks, burned all the trucks and cut the road. At that point, the corridor was once again blocked. For the next 24 hours, this small but sturdy German force defended the road against the counterattack. The fighting was reduced to tank against tank, man against man. Units of the 502nd Regiment, the 506th Regiment, and the British Royal Guard cornered the Germans and began to press them. By nightfall the next day, the remnants of the German force slipped away to the northwest. Behind them, they left a road so heavily mined that the 326th Regiment's engineers had to work another half day at great risk to clear the way for traffic. It wasn't until the 11th day of Operation Market Garden that the soldiers of the 101st could breathe deeply and believe that at least for the moment their side of the battle was won. Traffic on their side of the corridor was fluid. Even mail arrived from England. Some men obtained passes to Brussels. Some men in the 101st believed the Screaming Eagles would be relieved and sent back to England. The campaign had already dragged on for many more days than expected. After all, the Eagles were a striking force unit, not a common infantry division. But their days in Holland were far from over. While they fought around Wegel to keep the lifeline open, what happened in the north determined their fate for the next 2 months. From day 3, when the Nijmegen Bridge was taken, the British 30th Corps had tried to force a route north from the Waal River to the Nederrhein, but rain prevented tanks from getting through. The British advance was costly and slow. Finally, on the 5th, a group of light armoured vehicles managed to break away and make a sideways run toward Driel on the south bank of the river, not far from Arnhem. There they joined forces with a group of Polish paratroopers who had been deployed there. On the north bank of the river in Arnhem lay the British 1st Airborne Division, completely surrounded by an overwhelming force of Germans. Day by day the encirclement closed, and brave men died in fierce and bloody fighting until the remnants of the division were confined to a small area just west of Arnhem and north of the river. The continued resistance of the British in a desperate situation endures in history as one of the most heroic and tragic episodes of the war. On D-Day +8, under cover of night, the survivors were forced back across the river under the constant threat of total annihilation. Of the 10,095 men who marched or joined the battle, 2,490 returned across the river. The British, in effect, had attempted to venture a bridge too far. The Allied High Command abandoned the idea of reaching the Zuiderzee. It was accepted that the south bank of the Lower Rhine would be the northern limit of Operation Market Garden. Indeed, the operation, as planned, was a failure. It did not achieve what it had set out to do. The Allied troops had not crossed the Rhine. The Siegfried Line was not outflanked. Still, on the positive side, it could honestly be said that the operation had liberated large areas of Holland and advanced the northern flank of the Allied forces 96 kilometers. Undoubtedly, the soldiers of the 101st had done their part. They had seized and held their part of the corridor for much longer than initially anticipated, but not without cost. During the first 11 days of the campaign, the division had 373 men killed, 1,436 wounded, and 547 missing in action. But the 101st could not be called upon to rest. The British, weakened by the disaster at Arnhem, needed help holding the new front line along the Lower Rhine. When the situation in the southern part of the corridor stabilized, the 101st Division was sent north to take over a defense line that stretched east to west for 10 miles from the town of Ophiusden, on that stretch of flat, wet ground that came to be known as the island. The division spent 2 more months from the north bank of the river, where the terrain was rugged. German artillery could directly see the soldiers in the gorge. Any movement during daylight was dangerous. Supply vehicles faced endless shell fire to reach the front. It was almost like the terrible trench warfare of World War I. Trenches filling with water, poor food, constant sniping, shelling, deaths, a war of attrition. Here the soldiers first encountered the new German multi-barreled mortars, which screeched shrilly as they launched their shells into the sky. In early October, during a German attack, Colonel Johnson was killed by an artillery shell. Of the regiment's original commanders, only Colonel Sink remained. General Taylor also nearly died on the island. On the 9th of November, he was wounded by a mortar shell. For the men of the 101st, the grey and dangerous days seemed endless. They went on patrol, cursing the German artillery, the cold, the damp. They couldn't believe they would remain there through the winter. Their morale was slowly dwindling, their numbers were slowly dwindling, eroding under the merciless abrasion of the German artillery and the incessant snipers. Finally, in mid-November, the relief began. Unit after unit, the division was pulled from the line in Holland and sent to Mourmelon-le-Grand near the city of Reims, France. There, in what had once been a French artillery garrison, the division was to rest, re-equip, train replacements, and await the next call to action. As the advanced parties moved toward Mourmelon-le-Grand, fate once again played out the fate of the 101st Airborne Division. Once again, its numbers would be strained, for in an underground bunker in East Prussia, deep in a dark forest, Hitler and his generals were finalizing a plan that would force the soldiers to abandon their comfortable garrison too soon. A tremendous offensive was being prepared in Belgium, where its codename was Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine.